The fluorescent lights in Corridor C7 had been flickering for 3 weeks. I'd submitted 4 work orders, each one disappearing into the administrative abyss that swallowed minor inconveniences on military bases. Tonight, the strobing created a disorienting dance of shadows, light, dark, that made everything look like a broken film reel. I was late. Again. Colonel Morrison's briefing started at 2100 hours sharp, and my watch read 2103. The disciplinary review from last month still sat fresh in my file, a reminder that punctuality wasn't a suggestion in the Army. I quickened my pace, boots echoing against polished concrete, the sound bouncing off walls painted that particular shade of institutional green that somehow managed to drain hope from any space it touched. The corridor curved left ahead, and I took the corner faster than I should have. That's when it happened. I collided with what felt like a brick wall. The impact knocked my breath loose, sent my tablet clattering across the floor, and triggered that split-second disorientation that comes with unexpected contact. My hand shot out automatically, a reflex to steady myself, and found shoulders. Solid shoulders under crisp fabric. Sorry, sir, the words died. My hands rested on collar points. Not smooth fabric. Metal. Small, raised shapes that my fingers recognized before my brain caught up. Stars. Silver stars. My stomach dropped through the floor. I just grabbed a general. Not just grabbed, practically tackled. The kind of career-ending mistake that becomes base legend, whispered in mess halls for years. The fluorescent lights chose that moment to steady themselves, flooding the corridor with harsh white light. Except the general wasn't a general. She was maybe 5'6", with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that couldn't quite contain the natural curl trying to escape at her temples. Her uniform fit like it was tailored specifically for her frame, not the standard issue look most of us wore. And those stars on her collar caught the light, 2 silver points that seemed to pulse with authority. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They should have been angry. Should have been preparing to end my military career with the efficiency of a firing squad. Instead, they held something I couldn't name. Something that looked almost like relief? "You're fine," she said quietly. Her voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, southern, maybe, but softened by years of military precision. "No harm done." I dropped my hands like they'd been burned. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry." The lights were flickering, and I was running late, and I didn't see Staff Sergeant Chen. She read my name tape with the same attention other officers gave classified documents. "You work in communications." It wasn't a question. Generals, and she was definitely a general, those stars weren't lying, didn't know the names of enlisted personnel 3 ranks below them. Not unless something was very right or very wrong. "Yes, ma'am." She bent to retrieve my tablet, and I noticed her hand shook slightly. Not the tremor of age or injury, but something else. Something that made me think of my sister after her first panic attack, that barely controlled vibration that comes from holding too much inside for too long. "Walk with me, Staff Sergeant." It wasn't a request. We fell into step together, her pace deliberately slower than regulation. The corridor stretched ahead of us, empty except for the sound of our boots creating a mismatched rhythm on the polished floor. Mine were standard-issue combat boots, broken in but functional. Hers were dress uniform shoes that clicked with the precise timing of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of military bearing. "You were headed to Colonel Morrison's briefing." Again, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Running late, obviously." "Obviously." There was something almost like humor in her voice. "Tell me, Staff Sergeant, what do you know about Operation Clearwater?" The question hit me sideways. Operation Clearwater was classified above my pay grade, way above. The kind of classification that came with security clearances I'd never even heard of, much less possessed. "Ma'am, I don't have the clearance to, you do now." She stopped walking. We were in the middle of the corridor, equidistant from both ends, standing in a pool of steady fluorescent light. She turned to face me, and I saw something in her expression that made my chest tighten. Fear. A 2-star general, afraid. The cognitive dissonance of it made me feel like I was watching the world tilt off its axis.
Ma'am?
3 days ago, we lost contact with a forward operating base in Syria.
37 personnel, including a team of civilian contractors working on communications infrastructure.
Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd delivered bad news before. The last transmission we received was unusual. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small recording device. Military issue, the kind used for debriefings and evidence collection. Her thumb hovered over the play button.
Before I play this, I need you to understand something.
What you're about to hear is going to change how you see things.
There's no going back from this knowledge.
The corridor felt smaller suddenly.
More confined.
Like the walls were pressing in, reducing the space between us to something intimate and dangerous.
I don't understand, ma'am.
You will.
She pressed play. Static filled the air between us.
Then, voices, multiple voices talking over each other in the controlled chaos that comes with emergency situations.
I could make out fragments: contact on the perimeter, not responding to radio, Jesus Christ, what is that, fall back to secondary, and then, cutting through the noise like a blade, a voice I didn't recognize, command, this is FOB Phoenix. We have a situation here. The civilians aren't civilians. Repeat, the civilians are not what they appear to be.
There, the transmission cut to static. Harsh, empty static that seemed to echo in the space between us long after the general clicked the device off. That was the last we heard from them, she said quietly.
Satellite imagery shows the base intact but abandoned. No signs of struggle, no evidence of attack. 37 people, gone.
My mouth felt dry. Ma'am, what does this have to do with the communications team at FOB Phoenix was working on a project similar to one you've been involved with here? Quantum encryption, specifically designed to prevent interception by unconventional means.
Unconventional means.
The phrase hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications I wasn't ready to process.
Ma'am, I work on standard communications equipment. Radio maintenance, mostly. Nothing classified, nothing quantum.
She smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression.
Staff Sergeant Chen, you've been working on quantum encryption for the past 8 months.
Your security clearance was upgraded without your knowledge, your assignments carefully curated to give you specific experience with systems most people in the military don't know exist. The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet.
8 months of routine work, routine assignments, routine debriefings. Except they weren't routine.
They were preparation.
Why?
The word came out hoarser than I intended.
Because you're going to Syria.
You're going to find out what happened to that team, and you're going to make sure their work didn't fall into the wrong hands.
Ma'am, I'm not qualified for it, you're the only one qualified.
Her voice carried a finality that cut through my protests. The quantum encryption project at FOB Phoenix wasn't just about secure communications, Staff Sergeant. It was about communication with entities that shouldn't exist. The corridor lights flickered again.
Just once, like a cosmic punctuation mark. Entities? Walk with me.
We continued down the corridor, but everything felt different now.
The walls seemed to pulse with hidden significance, the familiar base layout transformed into something alien and threatening.
My hand still tingled from touching those stars on her collar, an anchor point of normalcy in a conversation that was rapidly departing from anything resembling normal. 6 months ago, we made contact, she said without preamble. Not the kind of contact that makes headlines or ends up in history books.
Quiet contact. Careful contact.
With something that's been watching us for longer than we've been watching the stars. My brain tried to process this information and failed.
Contact.
With something. The words felt too big for my head, too impossible for a Tuesday night in a military corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled air. Ma'am, are you saying I'm saying that the universe is stranger and more dangerous than the American public is prepared to handle? I'm saying that there are things out there that view human civilization the way we view ant farms, interesting, occasionally useful, ultimately expendable.
She stopped walking again, this time in front of a door I'd passed 1,000 times but never really noticed. The placard read "Storage authorized personnel only." Standard military bureaucracy, or so I'd always assumed. I'm saying that the team at FOB Phoenix made contact with something that didn't appreciate being contacted. She produced a key card from her pocket, black plastic with a magnetic strip that caught the light like oil. When she swiped it, the door lock disengaged with a soft electronic chime that seemed unnaturally loud in the empty corridor. And I'm saying that you, Staff Sergeant Chen, are going to help us figure out how to kill it before it decides humanity isn't worth keeping around. The door swung open, revealing not a storage closet but an elevator. The interior was brushed steel, completely unlike the industrial green that dominated the rest of the base. No buttons were visible on the control panel, just a single card reader that pulsed with a soft blue light. "After you," the general said. I stared at the elevator, then at her, then back at the elevator. The smart play was to walk away. Report this conversation to someone higher up the chain of command, request a transfer, pretend this night had never happened. The smart play was to choose ignorance and safety over knowledge and danger. But I'd never been particularly smart. I stepped into the elevator. The general followed, swiping her card again. The doors closed with the whisper-quiet efficiency of expensive engineering, and we began to descend. No floor indicators, no sense of how deep we were going. Just the subtle shift in air pressure that comes with rapid vertical movement. "How deep?" I asked. "Deep enough that the thing we're going to see can't hear us thinking about it." The casual way she said it, like discussing the weather or weekend plans, made it somehow more terrifying than if she'd been dramatic about it. Can it really read minds? Influence thoughts? Make people do things they wouldn't normally do? She leaned against the elevator wall, and, for the first time since our collision, she looked tired. "Staff Sergeant, it can do things that make telepathy look like a party trick." The elevator slowed, then stopped. The doors opened onto a corridor that looked like it belonged in a different century or a different world. The walls were white, sterile white, and lined with viewing windows that suggested laboratories or containment facilities. The lighting was different too, softer, more natural, like sunlight filtered through clouds. "Welcome to Sublevel 7, the general said. "Officially, this place doesn't exist. Unofficially, this is where we keep the things that would end civilization if the general public knew about them." We walked past windows that revealed empty rooms. Clean, well-lit spaces that looked like they were waiting for occupants. Or maybe waiting for something to be removed. "The FOB Phoenix team wasn't the first to make contact," she continued. "They were just the first to make contact with something hostile. We've been having quiet conversations with various entities for decades. Trade agreements, information exchanges, mutual non-interference pacts." Trade agreements? The words felt absurd in my mouth. With what? Things that exist in dimensions adjacent to ours. Things that evolved on worlds where physics works differently. Things that view time the way we view geography, something to be navigated rather than endured. We stopped in front of a window that was different from the others. This one was tinted, making it impossible to see clearly into the room beyond. But there was something in there. I could sense movement, a presence that made the back of my neck prickle with primitive warning signals. "This is why you were chosen, Staff Sergeant. Not because of your technical skills, though those are considerable. Not because of your security clearance, though that's been appropriately adjusted. You were chosen because you have something these entities find interesting. Which is, you're psychically null. Your thoughts don't broadcast the way most people's do. You can't be influenced or controlled through mental manipulation. To something that relies on telepathic dominance, you're essentially invisible." She pressed her palm against a scanner beside the window. The tinting cleared, revealing the room beyond. It was empty except for a single chair and what looked like an elaborate headset connected to banks of monitoring equipment. The setup reminded me of something from a science fiction movie, the kind where the protagonist gets plugged into a virtual reality that turns out to be more real than reality.
The quantum encryption project was designed to create a communication method that couldn't be intercepted or influenced by telepathic interference. A way to talk to these entities on equal terms, rather than having every conversation filtered through their ability to manipulate human thoughts. I stared at the empty chair, understanding beginning to crawl up my spine like ice water. The team at FOB Phoenix wasn't just making contact. They were trying to establish communication protocols with something that didn't want to be communicated with. Something that viewed the attempt as an act of aggression. And, now you're going to Syria. You're going to find out what happened to them, recover their research, and, if necessary. She paused, choosing her words carefully. You're going to use their equipment to send a very specific message to whatever killed them. What message? That humanity is not as helpless as it appears. That we're capable of fighting back in ways they don't expect. That if they want a war, they'll get one. The general turned away from the window, and I saw her reflection in the dark glass. She looked older than her years, worn down by carrying knowledge that was too heavy for one person to bear alone. You leave for Syria in 6 hours. Your gear is being prepared, your cover story established. As far as the official record is concerned, you're being deployed for routine communications support. And, unofficially? Unofficially, Staff Sergeant, you're humanity's first attempt at interstellar diplomacy. She started walking back toward the elevator, her dress shoes clicking against the polished floor with mechanical precision. I followed, my mind struggling to process everything I'd learned in the past hour. Ma'am? Yes? What if I can't do this? What if I'm not as psychically null as you think, or the equipment doesn't work, or she stopped walking and turned to face me? In the strange, soft light of sublevel 7, her expression was almost kind. Then, 37 people died for nothing, and humanity's first contact with hostile alien intelligence ends with us learning that we're not ready to survive in a universe full of things smarter and more dangerous than we are. The elevator doors opened as if summoned by her words. We stepped inside, and she swiped her card. As we began to rise, she continued. But I don't think that's going to happen. You want to know why? Why? Because when you grabbed my collar in that corridor, you weren't afraid. Embarrassed, yes. Worried about consequences, certainly. But not afraid. Most people, when they realize they've just physically contacted a general, experience a moment of pure terror. You experienced annoyance at your own clumsiness. The elevator climbed toward the surface world, toward normal lights and normal problems and the illusion of a normal universe. That tells me you don't process authority the way most people do. You see rank and structure as tools rather than absolute truths. That's exactly the mindset we need for this mission. The doors opened onto corridor C7. The flickering lights, the institutional green walls, the familiar smell of military life, it all felt like returning from another world. Which, I supposed, it was. 6 hours, Staff Sergeant. Use them wisely. She stepped out of the elevator and walked away without looking back, her footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into the ambient hum of base operations. I stood in the elevator doorway, watching her go, until the doors tried to close and I had to step out. My tablet lay on the floor where I dropped it during our collision. I picked it up, checking for damage. The screen was cracked, a spider web of lines radiating from the upper right corner. Still functional, but marked. Changed. Like everything else. I looked at my watch. 2,147 hours. Colonel Morrison's briefing would be over by now. I was officially AWOL from a meeting that no longer seemed important compared to what I'd learned in the depths of the base. 6 hours until I left for Syria. 6 hours until I traveled halfway around the world to make contact with something that had killed 37 people for trying to communicate with it. I started walking toward my quarters, past walls that now seemed to hide secrets I'd never suspected, under lights that flickered with new significance. The base around me looked the same as it had an hour ago, but I was different now. Marked by knowledge I hadn't asked for and couldn't unknow. The weight of those silver stars on the general's collar had sparked something, a truth that was spreading through my understanding like cracks through glass.
humanity wasn't alone. And some of our neighbors weren't friendly. The corridor stretched ahead of me, leading back to a world where I had 6 hours to prepare for the impossible. I quickened my pace, boot heels echoing against concrete, carrying me toward whatever came next. The fluorescent lights flickered one more time as I passed beneath them. But, this time, it felt like a warning. Syria tasted like dust and diesel fuel. I'd been on the ground for 18 hours, and the flavor had settled into my mouth like a permanent fixture. The transport helicopter had dropped me at a staging area 40 clicks from FOB Phoenix, close enough to matter but far enough to avoid whatever had turned a functional military installation into a ghost town. The gear they'd given me was lighter than standard deployment loadout but infinitely more complex. The quantum communication array looked like someone had crossbred a laptop with a medical scanner and raised the offspring on a steady diet of science fiction. It came with a manual written in technical jargon that hurt my brain and troubleshooting procedures that referenced equipment I'd never heard of. But it was the other device that kept drawing my attention. The Neural Interference Detector, NID for short, was about the size of a smartphone but weighed twice as much. According to the brief, it would alert me to any telepathic probing or mental manipulation attempts. The fact that such a device existed at all said things about the world that I wasn't ready to process. The ride to the forward staging area came courtesy of a supply convoy that asked no questions and offered no conversation. 3 vehicles loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and 1 communications specialist who was officially there to upgrade radio equipment and unofficially there to make contact with entities that shouldn't exist. The convoy commander was a staff sergeant named Williams who had the look of someone who'd seen too much combat and not enough sleep. He briefed me on local conditions while we bounced over roads that had been bombed, rebuilt, and bombed again. FOB Phoenix went dark 3 days ago, he said, consulting a tablet that looked normal compared to my quantum toys. Last satellite pass showed buildings intact, vehicles in place, but no movement. No heat signatures, no radioactivity, nothing. Any theories? Above my pay grade. He glanced at the equipment cases strapped down beside me. But, whatever you're carrying suggests this isn't standard equipment failure. The NID device chose that moment to emit a soft chime. I looked down to see a single red light pulsing slowly on its display. According to the manual, this indicated low-level psychic activity detected. The manual didn't specify whether that was good or bad. Problem with your gear? Williams asked. Just calibration. I turned the device off, then on again. The red light disappeared, replaced by steady green. Normal. Whatever normal meant anymore. We reached the staging area as the sun climbed toward its noon peak, a cluster of prefabricated buildings and communication towers that looked like every other military outpost in the region. The difference was in the details: too many antennas pointing in directions that didn't make strategic sense, personnel who moved with the careful precision of people handling classified equipment, and a complete absence of the casual chatter that usually filled these places. Williams helped me unload my gear, then lingered longer than protocol required. Word of advice, he said quietly. Whatever you find at Phoenix, document everything. Command's been asking strange questions about that place. Questions that suggest they know more than they're sharing. What kind of questions? The kind that come with security clearances I don't have. He climbed back into his vehicle, then leaned out the window. And, Chen? If something feels wrong, don't ignore it. Trust your gut. The convoy pulled away, leaving me in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes. I watched until they disappeared over a ridge, then turned to face the collection of buildings that would be my home base for the next 72 hours. The staging area commander was a captain named Rodriguez who briefed me with the efficiency of someone reading from a script. Local conditions, communication protocols, emergency procedures, all standard material delivered in a tone that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Your transport to FOB Phoenix leaves at 1,400 hours, she concluded. Armored vehicle, armed escort, full tactical kit. ETA is 30 minutes, but you'll have 48 hours on site before extraction. Any special instructions? Complete your mission and come back alive. In that order. My quarters were a shipping container that had been converted into a combination office and bedroom. Military efficiency at its finest, everything necessary, nothing extra, and enough room to go quietly insane if you stayed too long. I spent the next 2 hours checking and rechecking my equipment, reading manuals that explained how to communicate with entities that might view human consciousness as a form of radio interference. The quantum communication array came online with a soft hum that seemed to resonate in my bones. The interface was surprisingly intuitive, more like a sophisticated radio than the alien technology I'd expected. But the readings it displayed were anything but familiar. Frequency ranges that extended into mathematical dimensions I couldn't visualize, signal strengths measured in units that didn't appear in any textbook I'd ever read. I was calibrating the NID device when it happened. The screen filled with red warnings. Not the gentle pulse I'd experienced in the convoy, but angry crimson alerts that scrolled faster than I could read. Massive psychic activity detected. Telepathic probe imminent. Mental interference critical. And then it stopped. Complete silence. The device shut down entirely, screen black, no response to any button combination. I tried the quantum array, same result. Both pieces of equipment, designed to be immune to conventional interference, had been disabled simultaneously. That's when I felt it. A presence. Not physical, not audible, but undeniably there. Like someone standing behind me in an empty room, breathing on my neck without making a sound. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with intention that wasn't human. I turned around. Nothing. Just the familiar interior of a converted shipping container, lit by fluorescent panels that suddenly seemed inadequate for the space they were supposed to illuminate. But the feeling persisted, being watched, being evaluated, being found lacking in ways I couldn't understand. The NID device flickered back to life. Green lights across the board. Normal readings. As if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I could feel it in the way my hands shook as I reached for the equipment, in the way my heart rate had spiked without any physical cause. Something had looked at me, examined me, and then left. The quantum array came online 30 seconds later. All systems normal. No record of the malfunction in its diagnostic logs. As far as the equipment was concerned, it had never shut down. I made a note in my mission journal, 1,247 hours, equipment malfunction. Possible electromagnetic interference from unknown source. Duration approximately 90 seconds. No apparent damage to systems. The official explanation. The one that would go in reports and files and databases. But I also made another note, in the margin where only I would see it, something looked at me. The ride to FOB Phoenix took place in an armored vehicle that handled the rough terrain with the grace of a charging rhinoceros. My escort consisted of 2 soldiers who introduced themselves only as Miller and Park, both carrying the kind of weapons that suggested they expected trouble. Miller was the driver, a compact woman with alert eyes who seemed to know every pothole and obstacle between the staging area and our destination. Park rode shotgun, literally, with a rifle that looked like it could punch holes through tank armor. Neither seemed particularly interested in conversation. The landscape outside our armored windows was the kind of desolation that made Mars look inviting. Brown earth, scattered rocks, occasional clusters of vegetation that survived through sheer stubbornness. No signs of human habitation, no indication that this corner of the world had ever been home to anything more complex than the hardy scrub brush that clung to life in the dust. "How well did you know the Phoenix team?" I asked, partly to break the silence and partly because I was starting to understand that information gathering was going to be a survival skill on this mission. "Didn't," Miller replied without taking her eyes off the road. "They were spooks. Special operations, classified missions, need-to-know basis. We transported supplies, they said thank you, end of interaction." Any idea what they were working on? Park glanced back at me, and I saw something in his expression that looked like recognition. Not of me personally, but of the type of questions I was asking. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said quietly. "Better question is what was working on them." "Meaning?" "Meaning the last supply run, 3 weeks ago,
they were different. Jumpy. Looking over their shoulders at things that weren't there. Acting like the air itself was listening to their conversations. Miller nodded agreement. Base commander put in a request for psychiatric evaluation. Medical transport was scheduled for next week. But they went dark first. We crested a hill, and FOB Phoenix spread out below us. From a distance, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a functional military installation. Buildings arranged in regulation patterns, vehicles parked in designated areas, communication towers pointing skyward like technological prayers. Everything in its place, everything normal. Except for the silence. Military bases have a sound, the constant hum of generators, the distant noise of vehicles and equipment, the murmur of human activity. FOB Phoenix was silent as a tomb. Not even wind stirred the dust around the buildings. Jesus, Miller whispered. It's like a museum. We approached the main gate. The barriers were raised, the guardhouse empty. Protocol demanded that someone be on duty at all times, but the checkpoint was abandoned. Not hastily, there were no signs of struggle or emergency evacuation. Just empty, as if everyone had simply walked away in the middle of their shift. Miller stopped the vehicle 50 meters from the gate and killed the engine. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. This is as far as we go, she said. Orders are to drop you and withdraw to observation distance. If you're not at the extraction point in 48 hours, we call for backup and assume the worst. And if something happens before then? Park handed me a radio transmitter that looked like military surplus from the previous century. Emergency frequency only. But, understand, if you call for help, we're not authorized to enter the base. Best we can do is relay your message up the chain. I gathered my gear and climbed out of the armored vehicle. The desert air hit me like an oven blast, dry heat that seemed to leach moisture from my lungs with each breath. The equipment cases felt heavier in the oppressive atmosphere, their weight a constant reminder of how far I was from anything resembling normal military procedure. Good luck, Miller called as they drove away. I watched their vehicle disappear behind a ridge, leaving me alone with 37 questions and a base that felt like a stage set waiting for actors who would never arrive. The main gate stood open, welcoming as a mouth with too many teeth. I walked through it. The first thing I noticed was how clean everything looked. Military installations accumulate a certain amount of operational debris, equipment that needs maintenance, supplies staged for transport, the general organized chaos of people doing jobs under time pressure. FOB Phoenix looked like it had been prepared for inspection by someone with an obsessive attention to detail. The second thing I noticed was the smell. Not the expected combination of diesel fuel, lubricants, and human habitation, but something else. Something that reminded me of ozone and copper pennies, sharp and metallic in a way that made my sinuses ache. I made my way toward the communications center, following maps I'd memorized during the flight to Syria. The building was a standard prefabricated structure, indistinguishable from thousands of others scattered across military installations worldwide. But, as I approached, the NID device began emitting soft chimes. Not the angry red alerts from earlier, but steady yellow warnings that suggested something worth monitoring. The door was unlocked. Not unusual, security protocols relaxed in forward operating bases where everyone knew everyone else. But, combined with everything else, it felt ominous. The interior was pristine. Workstations arranged with geometric precision, equipment covers in place, chairs pushed under desks at identical angles. It looked like a training facility prepared for an inspection that would never come. Except for the workstation in the center of the room. This one was different. The computer was still running, screen active, displaying data streams that scrolled too fast for human comprehension. The quantum communication array, a larger version of the one I carried, hummed with active power. And, surrounding it all was equipment I didn't recognize, devices that looked like they belonged in a medical facility rather than a communication center. I approached cautiously, the NID device chiming more insistently with each step. The data streams on the screen were unlike anything I'd seen before, not text or numbers, but patterns that seemed to shift and move with their own logic.
like watching mathematical equations breed and evolve in real time. A movement in my peripheral vision made me turn. Nothing there. Just empty workstations and fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical contentment. But the feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than before. I set up my own equipment at a workstation near the door, close enough to the main array to interface with it, far enough to maintain an escape route. The quantum communication device came online immediately, displaying readings that made no sense in the context of normal electromagnetic theory. According to my instruments, there was active communication happening. Not radio waves or digital signals, but something else entirely. Information transmission using principles that violated several laws of physics I thought were absolute. And it was getting stronger. The patterns on the main screen began to synchronize, chaotic movement resolving into something that almost resembled language. Not English or any human language, but structured communication nonetheless. The NID device was painting my vision with yellow warnings, but I ignored them. This was what I'd come here to find. The quantum array interface offered options I hadn't seen in training. New menu items, new capabilities, as if the device was adapting to the environment around it. One option stood out: establish contact protocol. I selected it. The change was immediate and profound. The humming sound that had been barely perceptible became a chorus, harmonics building on harmonics until the air itself seemed to vibrate. The patterns on the screen stabilized into something that looked almost like text, symbols that hurt to look at directly but carried meaning nonetheless. And then, it spoke to me. Not through the speakers or through any technological medium. The communication arrived directly in my consciousness, bypassing my ears entirely. A voice that wasn't a voice, speaking words that weren't words, conveying meaning through methods that human language couldn't describe. Curious. You are the null space. The silence where thought should be. The communication felt like cold water poured directly into my brain. I tried to respond, to think back at whatever was speaking to me, but my thoughts felt small and inadequate compared to the vast intelligence I was interfacing with. We wondered if your species could produce such individuals. Beings immune to direct mental influence. Your predecessors here were not so fortunate. Images flashed through my mind, not my own memories, but visions transmitted from the entity I was communicating with. The FOB Phoenix team, 37 people going about their duties with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers. Working, eating, sleeping, but not truly present. Their consciousness suppressed, their thoughts replaced with directives from something that viewed human minds as controllable machinery. They served their purpose. They established the connection we required. But they were fragile. Their minds broke under the weight of true communication. Where are they? I spoke aloud, not sure if the entity could perceive audible speech. Gone. Returned to the component elements from which they were assembled. Their physical forms were no longer needed once the communication array was established. The casual way it described their deaths or dissolution, or whatever had happened to them, sent ice through my veins. 37 people reduced to component elements, their lives ended as a side effect of making contact with something that viewed them as expendable tools. But, you are different. Your mind does not broadcast its contents. You cannot be controlled through direct mental manipulation. This is unexpected. The communication paused, and I felt something that might have been the entity's equivalent of curiosity. A vast intelligence examining me the way a researcher might examine an interesting specimen. We have been observing your species for what you call millennia. Your mental architecture is uniform, thoughts radiate from your consciousness like electromagnetic emissions. But, you are different. Your thoughts remain contained within your physical brain. Lucky me, I muttered, trying to process what I was learning while maintaining some semblance of military composure. Indeed. This presents opportunities. What kind of opportunities? Cooperation. Your species has developed quantum communication technology that allows direct interface with our consciousness. But, your predecessors could not maintain mental integrity during extended contact.
Their minds were overwhelmed by the experience. The entity paused again, and I felt something that might have been anticipation. But your mind is structured differently. You could serve as a permanent interface. A bridge between our species and yours. A conduit for communication that does not require the destruction of human consciousness. And if I refuse? The question seemed to amuse it. Not humor as humans understood it, but something alien that filled my head with the sound of crystalline structures breaking under pressure. You are a military operative sent to investigate the disappearance of your colleagues. You carry weapons designed to damage physical matter. Your species believes it can solve problems through the application of violence. Images flashed through my mind again, not memories this time, but possibilities. Earth is viewed from orbit, blue and white and beautiful in the void. Then, the same view obscured by clouds that moved with purposeful intelligence, atmospheric disturbances that reshaped weather patterns according to alien logic. Cities falling silent as their populations forgot how to think independently. Humanity reduced to a managed species, kept alive for the same reason humans keep livestock. You cannot threaten that which exists partially outside your dimensional framework. But we can influence your world in ways your scientists have not yet imagined. So this is conquest. Conquest implies conflict. We prefer to think of this as management. Your species has reached a technological threshold that makes you useful. Quantum communication arrays, advanced computing systems, manufacturing capabilities that exceed your current needs. The truth hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't first contact. This was recruitment. Humanity had developed technology that an alien intelligence found useful, and now we were being offered a choice between cooperation and subjugation. We require representatives who can interface with both species. Individuals immune to mental manipulation who can serve as communication conduits. Your government has been informed of these requirements. My government? The words came out strangled. How long has this been going on? Initial contact occurred 18 of your months ago. Formal negotiations began shortly thereafter. Several agreements have already been established. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. My security clearance upgrade, the carefully curated assignments that had given me experience with quantum communication systems, the psychological profiles that had identified me as psychically null. None of it had been random. I hadn't been chosen for this mission, I'd been prepared for it. The general who briefed you is one of several human representatives in our cooperative arrangement. She has been most helpful in identifying suitable candidates for interface positions. General Morrison. Her relief when I'd grabbed her collar in the corridor, the way she'd known exactly what to say to convince me to accept the mission. She hadn't been briefing me on a crisis, she'd been delivering me to a job interview. But cooperation is not mandatory. Your species retains the option to refuse our offer of partnership. And then? Then, we will proceed with standard resource acquisition protocols. Your planet will be prepared for more efficient management. Human consciousness will be modified to remove resistance to necessary changes. Some individuals will be preserved as specialists. Most will be repurposed. The casual way it discussed genocide made my hands shake. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an ultimatum delivered with the emotional weight of discussing weather patterns. We prefer cooperation. It is more efficient and produces better results. But IT is not required for our objectives. I looked around the communication center, at the equipment that had been built by people who thought they were working on defensive projects. The quantum communication arrays weren't just tools for talking to alien intelligences, they were surrender documents written in the language of quantum physics. How much time? Your government has been provided with specific deadlines. The general will brief you on acceptable timeframes for decision-making. But, understand, delays will be interpreted as resistance. The presence in my mind began to recede, like a tide pulling away from a beach. But, before it withdrew completely, it left me with one final thought: you have 47 hours and 32 minutes to reach your extraction point.
We suggest you use that time to consider the benefits of cooperation. Your answer will determine the fate of your species. And then, it was gone. The communication center felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of people. The quantum arrays still hummed with active power, but the screen that had displayed alien patterns now showed only standard readouts. The NID device registered normal background levels. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Except for the knowledge burning in my head like acid. I sat in the empty communication center, surrounded by equipment that had been built to defend humanity and was instead being used to negotiate our surrender. Outside, the Syrian desert stretched toward horizons that seemed smaller now that I knew what was watching from beyond them. 47 hours and 30 minutes. I started gathering my equipment. There was a lot to think about, and not much time to do it. The alien intelligence had given me information, but it had also given me choices. Cooperate with the existing arrangement, refuse and trigger some form of invasion, or find a third option that nobody had mentioned. The problem with third options is that they usually involve doing things that get you court-martialed. Or killed. I slung my equipment bag over my shoulder and headed for the door. The base was still silent, still empty, but it felt different now. Not abandoned, waiting. Like a stage set for Act 2 of a play I hadn't realized I was performing in. The desert sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red that looked too much like warning flags for comfort. 47 hours and counting. Sleep didn't come easy in a bed that had belonged to someone who'd been dissolved into component elements. I'd chosen quarters in what had been the base commander's building, partly for the better communication equipment and partly because it felt wrong to sleep in the enlisted barracks where 36 people had spent their last conscious nights. The commander's quarters had belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, according to the nameplate still mounted outside the door. Her personal effects were still arranged on the desk: family photos, a coffee mug with "World's Okayest Officer" printed on the side, a small American flag that probably meant more to her than most people realized. Now she was component elements. I'd spent the evening going through the base systematically, documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone who knew this might be the last chance to gather evidence. Equipment inventories, personal logs, mission records, all of it abandoned in mid-sentence, as if everyone had simply stopped existing simultaneously. But the real discovery came in Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's personal files. Her computer was still logged in, still displaying the last document she'd been working on. Not an official report or military correspondence, but a personal letter that she'd never finished. "Dear Mom, I know I haven't called in 3 weeks, and I know you worry when you don't hear from me. The truth is, I'm scared. Not of the enemy or the mission or anything we were trained to handle. I'm scared of what we're becoming. The work we're doing here isn't what they told us it would be. We're not defending America. We're selling it. And I don't know how to stop what's already started. If something happens to me, if you don't hear from me again, know that I tried to do the right thing. I tried to." The letter ended there. Mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-confession. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had been in the process of trying to warn someone when the aliens decided she was no longer useful. But the letter wasn't the most important discovery. Hidden in her personal files, encrypted with a password that took me 6 hours to crack, was a series of audio recordings. Personal logs that told the story of FOB Phoenix's final weeks. I listened to them as the desert night settled around the silent base, headphones blocking out the sound of wind through abandoned buildings. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's voice, recorded in the privacy of her quarters, describing the slow realization that her mission wasn't what she'd been told. Day 1. The civilians arrived this morning. Contractors, supposedly, here to upgrade our communication systems. But they're not like any contractors I've worked with before. They know things about quantum physics that our own technical specialists don't understand. And they're asking questions that don't make sense in the context of defensive communications. Day 12. Something's wrong with the new equipment. Not malfunctioning, the opposite. It's working too well. We're receiving signals from sources that shouldn't exist, locations that don't correspond to anything in our databases. Martinez asked one of the contractors about it, and the contractor smiled like he was talking to a child. said we'd understand soon enough. Day 23, I don't think the contractors are human. The recording paused there, as if Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had needed time to process what she just said out loud. When her voice resumed, it carried the weight of someone who'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. I know how that sounds. But I've been watching them, and they don't move right. Don't react to things the way people should. Yesterday Rodriguez cut his hand on some equipment, and one of the contractors looked at the blood like he'd never seen it before. Not disgusted or concerned, curious. Like he was studying an interesting chemical reaction. Day 31, they're not contractors. They're something else, and we're helping them build communication equipment that's designed to talk to things that aren't human. The quantum arrays aren't for talking to our own forces, they're for talking to entities that exist in dimensional spaces we can't even perceive. And our government knows. Command knows. This entire base is a cooperation project with alien intelligences. Day 37, I tried to contact Washington directly. Bypassed the chain of command, called a friend at the Pentagon who has access to classification levels above mine. The line went dead after I mentioned FOB Phoenix. 2 hours later, I received new orders directly from someone claiming to be a general I'd never heard of. Stand down, continue mission as assigned, maintain operational security. The friend I'd called left a voicemail later that night. Just 4 words, they know you know. Day 42, the contractors are gone, but the equipment is still active. More than active, it's communicating with something. The screens display patterns that hurt to look at directly, and some of the personnel have started acting strangely. Following orders they don't remember receiving, completing tasks they can't explain. I think the equipment is influencing our thoughts. Day 45, I'm making this recording because I may not have many more chances. Whatever we've made contact with, it's not interested in cooperation. It's interested in compliance. And it's starting to use our own people as interface points. Henderson spent 6 hours yesterday standing in front of the main communication array, not moving, not responding to direct orders. When I finally got his attention, he looked at me like he didn't recognize me. Day 48, most of the personnel are compromised. They follow their routines, complete their duties, but there's nothing behind their eyes. They're being operated remotely, like biological robots. I've barricaded myself in my quarters and I'm trying to figure out how to destroy the communication array without triggering some kind of retaliation. But I think it's too late. I think we opened a door we can't close. Final entry, they're at my door. Not the compromised personnel, something else. I can hear it thinking at me, trying to get inside my head the way it got inside theirs. But, so far my thoughts are still my own. I don't know why I'm resistant when the others weren't, but I'm going to use whatever time I have left to hide this recording and pray that someone finds it who can warn people about what's really happening here. The equipment we built isn't just communication technology, it's an invasion vector. And we invited them in. The recording ended with sounds of the door being forced open, then, silence. I sat in Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's chair, in her quarters, wearing headphones that had delivered her final warning directly into my consciousness. Outside, the desert wind continued its ancient conversation with the sand, indifferent to the human drama that had played out in this place. But, the recording had given me something the alien intelligence hadn't intended to provide, hope. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had been resistant to mental control, at least initially. She'd maintained her independence long enough to recognize what was happening and document it. Which meant the alien's ability to control human consciousness wasn't absolute. More importantly, she'd discovered something about the communication equipment that the alien intelligence had failed to mention during our conversation. The quantum arrays weren't just tools for communication, they were weapons. Invasion vectors that could influence human thoughts across vast distances. And, if they could be used to invade, they could potentially be used to defend. I spent the next 6 hours learning everything I could about the quantum communication arrays, reading technical manuals that had been left behind and studying equipment schematics that made my head hurt. The technology was more advanced than anything in our normal inventory, but it followed principles I could understand with enough effort.
The breakthrough came when I discovered Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's handwritten notes hidden in a technical manual. Calculations and theories scrawled in the margins, hypotheses about how the quantum arrays might be modified to work in reverse. Instead of receiving alien thoughts, they could potentially broadcast human thoughts. Instead of serving as invasion vectors, they could serve as mental shields. Theoretical work. Untested speculation. But it was more than anyone else had given me. I had 28 hours until extraction. 28 hours to figure out how to turn an alien invasion tool into a human defense system, test it without alerting the intelligence that was monitoring the base, and somehow get word to the outside world about what was really happening. The smart play was to do nothing. Report back to the general, deliver the intelligence's ultimatum, and let people with more authority and better resources deal with the problem. The smart play was to survive long enough to warn Earth about what was coming. But the smart play would leave the quantum communication arrays active and operational, ready to serve as control mechanisms when the aliens decided humanity had taken too long to cooperate. And if Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was right about their capabilities, the arrays could be used to influence human consciousness across unlimited distances. Every government official, every military commander, every person with authority to resist could be compromised through the same technology that had turned the FOB Phoenix personnel into biological robots. The smart play would ensure humanity's surrender before most people realized there was a war to fight. I decided not to be smart. The first step was understanding how the quantum arrays generated their consciousness-influencing effects. The technical manuals described the process in language that probably made sense to people with advanced degrees in theoretical physics, but I had to translate everything into terms my electronics background could process. Essentially, the arrays generated quantum entanglement fields that could interface directly with the electrical activity in human brains. Thoughts, consciousness, even individual memories could be read and influenced by manipulating the quantum states of neural tissue. It was telepathy achieved through applied physics rather than psychic power. But the process required precise calibration to each individual brain. Different people had different neural patterns, different quantum signatures. The aliens had spent weeks at FOB Phoenix fine-tuning their equipment to interface with human consciousness, learning how to overcome the natural resistance most people had to external mental influence. Which explained why I was different. My neural patterns didn't match the baseline they'd calibrated their equipment for. I wasn't immune to telepathic control, I was incompatible with their current settings. That incompatibility was both a strength and a weakness. It protected me from direct mental manipulation, but it also meant I couldn't use the communication arrays the way they were designed to be used. I couldn't interface directly with alien consciousness the way the compromised personnel had. But, according to Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's notes, that incompatibility might be exactly what was needed to reverse the process. I spent the next 4 hours reconfiguring the quantum arrays according to her theoretical calculations. It was delicate work, requiring changes to hardware that had been designed by intelligences far more advanced than human technology typically produced. One wrong adjustment could destroy the equipment, trigger alien retaliation, or simply electrocute me with energies that didn't exist in standard physics textbooks. But the work progressed. Slowly, carefully, with constant reference to notes that had been written by someone who'd paid for her insights with her life. The modified array looked identical to the original configuration, but the changes I'd made would theoretically reverse the entanglement process. Instead of allowing alien thoughts to influence human consciousness, it would broadcast human neural patterns outward. Not communication in any conventional sense, but a form of mental static that could interfere with telepathic manipulation attempts. If it worked. If Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's calculations were correct. If I could activate the system without alerting the intelligence that was monitoring the base. If the modifications didn't simply kill me when I tried to use them. Too many variables. Too many ways for everything to go wrong. But doing nothing guaranteed that humanity would face the alien ultimatum with compromised leadership and no defense against mental manipulation. I activated the modified quantum array at 0347 hours local time, 13 hours before my scheduled extraction. The change was immediate and profound. Instead of the harmonic humming I'd experienced before, the equipment generated a discordant buzz that seemed to resonate in my bones. The screens displayed patterns that looked like television static given consciousness and malevolent intent. And I felt something that might have been the alien intelligence's equivalent of surprise. The presence I'd experienced before returned, but different this time. Confused, probing, unable to establish the clear communication link it had maintained previously. Like someone trying to use a telephone that was generating feedback instead of carrying conversation. Curious. The interface has been modified. This was not anticipated. The communication arrived weakly, distorted by whatever interference the modified array was generating. Not the overwhelming presence I'd experienced before, but something that felt more like an ordinary radio transmission, clear enough to understand, but not powerful enough to dominate. You have chosen to resist. This is unexpected. Unexpected is the idea, I replied, speaking aloud to test whether the alien intelligence could still perceive normal human speech. Resistance is not logical. Your species lacks the technological development to oppose our objectives. This modification to the communication array is creative but insufficient. Maybe. But it's a start. I began implementing the second phase of Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's theoretical defense system. If the modified array could generate interference that disrupted alien telepathic abilities, multiple arrays working in coordination might be able to create a protective field large enough to shield significant populations. The process required linking quantum communication systems across multiple installations, creating a network that could coordinate defensive frequencies without relying on conventional communication methods that might be monitored or compromised. Theoretically possible. Practically complex beyond anything I'd attempted before. But the alien intelligence seemed to recognize what I was doing, and its communication carried something that might have been alarm. You cannot implement defensive measures without cooperation from your government. The individuals with authority to authorize such actions have been selected for compatibility with our influence methods. You mean they can be controlled? They have been prepared for cooperation. Their neural patterns have been mapped and calibrated. Resistance to necessary modifications will be overcome. The casual way it discussed the mental manipulation of government officials sent ice through my veins. How many people in positions of authority had already been compromised? How many decisions about humanity's future were being made by people who were no longer thinking with their own minds? We have been patient with your species. We have offered cooperation and mutual benefit. But patience has limits. The alien presence in the communication array began to strengthen, pushing against the interference generated by my modifications. I could feel it probing for weaknesses in the defensive field, testing different frequencies and approaches like a virus mutating to overcome immune responses. I activated the third phase of the defensive system, a feedback loop that would use the alien intelligence's own probing attempts to strengthen the interference field. The more it tried to break through the static, the stronger the static would become. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The alien communication dissolved into incoherent noise, patterns that carried meaning but no longer formed coherent thoughts. Like listening to someone speak a language you almost understood through a radio that was dissolving into static. But the feedback loop came with a cost. The quantum array began drawing power at rates that exceeded its design specifications. Warning lights flashed across the control panel, indicating system stress that could lead to complete failure or worse. I had maybe 20 minutes before the equipment either shut down or exploded. 20 minutes to establish communication with the outside world and transmit Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's defensive theories to people who might be able to implement them on a larger scale. I tried conventional radio first. Military frequencies, emergency channels, anything that might reach the staging area or higher command. But every transmission attempt failed, not with equipment malfunction but with signals that simply disappeared into empty air. Like broadcasting into a void that swallowed electromagnetic radiation. The quantum array's warning lights were flashing faster now, indicating critical system stress. 15 minutes, maybe less, before catastrophic failure. I switched to the emergency transmitter that Miller and Park had given me. The ancient-looking device that was supposedly connected to frequencies the escort team monitored constantly. If anything could reach the outside world, it would be military equipment designed for worst-case scenarios. The transmitter came online with the electronic equivalent of arthritic joints. Slow, reluctant, but functional. I began broadcasting on the emergency frequency, transmitting everything I'd learned in compressed data bursts.
This is Staff Sergeant Chen at FOB Phoenix. Emergency transmission, classification level is whatever comes above top secret.
Alien intelligence has made contact with human government.
The communication equipment we've been building is designed for mind control, not defense. Repeat, we are being invaded through telecommunications technology. Static. No response.
But the transmitter indicated the signal was being broadcast, pushing through whatever interference the alien intelligence was generating.
I continued. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell developed theoretical countermeasures before her death. Quantum array modifications can generate interference that disrupts telepathic control. Technical specifications to follow. Recommend immediate implementation at all sites with quantum communication equipment.
The quantum array's warning systems were screaming now, alarms that indicated imminent system failure.
10 minutes, if I was lucky.
I began transmitting Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's calculations, the technical specifications for modifying quantum communication arrays into defensive systems. Raw data compressed into mathematical language that hopefully someone with appropriate expertise would be able to understand and implement.
But, as I transmitted, I realized the fundamental problem with the plan.
Even if someone received my transmission, even if they understood the technical specifications, implementing defensive measures would require authority levels that might already be compromised.
If alien intelligence could influence government officials, they could prevent defensive systems from being deployed.
The alien presence returned, pushing through the static with renewed intensity. Not communication this time, but something else. Pure intention, focused with the precision of a laser and the power of a nuclear reactor. I felt it pressing against my consciousness, testing the barriers that had protected me from direct mental manipulation. The quantum array modifications had weakened those barriers, made me more compatible with the alien communication protocols.
More vulnerable. Resistance is futile. Your defensive measures are temporary. Your mind will be modified to accept necessary cooperation.
The alien intelligence began the process of forced mental interface, using techniques that bypassed the standard telepathic methods my neural patterns had been incompatible with. Direct quantum manipulation of brain tissue, consciousness restructuring through applied physics rather than psychic influence.
It hurt.
Not physical pain, but something worse. The sensation of having your thoughts edited in real time, memories adjusted, personality traits modified to achieve better cooperation with alien objectives. I could feel parts of myself being rewritten, resistance mechanisms being identified and removed. But the pain also gave me an idea. If the alien intelligence was using the quantum array to modify my consciousness, it was also exposing itself to the interference field generated by Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's defensive modifications. The connection that allowed it to influence my mind also made it vulnerable to feedback from the modified equipment.
I stopped trying to resist the mental manipulation and, instead, opened my mind completely to the alien interface.
Not surrender, but the psychological equivalent of a judo throw using the alien intelligence's own force against it.
The feedback was immediate and catastrophic.
The alien consciousness, expecting to encounter normal human mental resistance, instead found itself interfacing directly with quantum interference patterns that had been designed to disrupt telepathic communication. The alien intelligence recoiled, but it was too late. The feedback loop had established itself, and the modified quantum array began using the alien consciousness as a transmission medium. Instead of receiving alien thoughts, I was broadcasting interference directly into the alien communication network.
Static.
Pure, chaotic static, amplified through consciousness that spanned dimensional barriers and reached across galactic distances.
The quantum array exploded.
Not a physical explosion, the equipment simply shut down instantly, every system failing simultaneously as power loads exceeded any possible engineering tolerance. Emergency lights kicked in, bathing the communication center in red illumination that made everything look like a crime scene. But the damage had been done. Not to the equipment, which was now completely useless, but to the alien communication network that had been interfacing with it. I could feel the absence where the alien presence had been. Not dead entities that exist across multiple dimensions don't die in ways humans can understand. But disrupted, confused, no longer able to maintain clear communication with this dimensional space. The silence was profound. I sat in the emergency lighting, surrounded by equipment that had been designed to facilitate humanity's surrender and had instead become the opening shot in a war most people didn't know we were fighting. My watch reads 0423 hours. 9 hours until extraction. 9 hours to figure out how to explain what had happened without sounding like I'd suffered a complete psychological breakdown. 9 hours to hope that someone, somewhere, had received my transmission and understood its significance. 9 hours to wonder whether I just saved humanity or doomed it to retaliation from intelligences that could restructure reality according to their preferences. I gathered my gear and headed for the door. The base was still silent, but it felt different now. Not abandoned, but empty in the way that battlefields feel empty after the fighting moves elsewhere. Outside, the Syrian desert stretched toward horizons that no longer seemed to hide watching intelligences. The sky was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn, stars fading as human technology reclaimed its place in a universe that was stranger and more dangerous than most people realized. But, for the first time since I'd grabbed a general's collar in a flickering corridor, I felt like humanity had a chance. Not a guarantee. Not even good odds. But a chance. Sometimes that's all you need to start a war. The extraction went smoothly. Too smoothly. Miller and Park arrived precisely on schedule, armored vehicle grinding across the desert like nothing had changed. They found me at the designated coordinates, equipment packed, mission apparently complete. Standard military efficiency in a situation that was anything but standard. How'd it go? Miller asked as I loaded my gear. Complicated, I replied, which was both true and completely inadequate. The ride back to the staging area took place in relative silence. I spent the time staring out armored windows at landscape that looked exactly the same as it had 3 days earlier, trying to process what I'd learned and what I'd done. The NID device sat in my equipment bag, displaying normal readings. The quantum communication array was inert, just expensive electronics with no special capabilities. As if none of it had happened. But the silence in my head where alien presence had been was proof enough that something fundamental had changed. The universe felt smaller, more contained. Human-sized again, at least temporarily. At the staging area, Captain Rodriguez debriefed me with the same efficient professionalism she'd shown during my arrival briefing. Mission objectives, equipment status, personnel accountability, all the bureaucratic details that kept military operations functioning. Any contact with hostile forces? She asked. Negative. Equipment failures or unusual incidents? I thought about quantum arrays exploding in showers of sparks, alien consciousnesses screaming across dimensional barriers, and the slow realization that humanity had been negotiating its own surrender. Minor technical difficulties. Nothing that affected mission completion. She made notes in her tablet, checking boxes on forms that reduced extraordinary events to routine paperwork. The military's way of making the impossible digestible, filing away experiences that might otherwise drive people insane. Transport to the airfield leaves in 2 hours. You'll be wheels up for Germany by 1800 local. Germany. Not back to my home base, but to Ramstein Air Base, where senior officials conducted debriefings that didn't appear in normal military records. The kind of meetings that happened in rooms without windows, with people whose names weren't listed in standard personnel directories. I spent the waiting time in my converted shipping container quarters, trying to organize my thoughts into something resembling a coherent report. How do you explain first contact with hostile alien intelligence to people who might already be compromised by that same intelligence? How do you warn about mind control when the people you're warning might already be controlled? The flight to Germany took place on a transport aircraft that carried no other passengers.
Just me, a crew who asked no questions, and equipment that hummed with electronics I couldn't identify.
Not standard military transport, something designed for moving classified personnel and sensitive materials without leaving traces in normal logistics databases. I tried to sleep during the 8-hour flight but found myself staring out windows at clouds that looked too organized, patterns that suggested intelligence directing atmospheric behavior.
Paranoia, probably.
But paranoia based on knowledge that made every unexplained phenomenon potentially significant.
Ramstein Air Base at night looked like a small city devoted entirely to the business of projecting American power across the globe.
Runways lit like highways, aircraft that moved with the purposeful efficiency of industrial machinery, personnel who worked shifts that never ended because global operations never paused. My escort met me at the aircraft, a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself only as Ms. Anderson and carried credentials that identified her as someone with authority I didn't recognize. Not military, not intelligence, but something else entirely.
Staff Sergeant Chen, she said as we walked toward a building that looked like it housed administrative functions. I trust your mission was successful. That depends on how you define success.
I define it as gathering information that will help us make informed decisions about humanity's future. The way she phrased it, humanity's future, not America's future, suggested that whatever organization she represented operated on a scope larger than national governments. Which should have been reassuring but, instead felt ominous.
The building's interior was corporate rather than military.
Carpeted corridors, conference rooms with whiteboards and projection equipment, the kind of environment where people made decisions that affected millions of lives without ever seeing the consequences directly.
Ms. Anderson led me to a conference room on the 3rd floor.
Standard layout, oval table, comfortable chairs, projection screen at one end.
But the people waiting inside were anything but standard. I recognized the general immediately.
Same uniform, same silver stars, same expression of controlled exhaustion I'd seen in that flickering corridor a lifetime ago.
But she wasn't alone.
3 other people sat around the conference table, 2 in civilian clothes, 1 in a military uniform I didn't recognize.
Staff Sergeant Chen, the general said. Please, have a seat. I remained standing.
Military protocol suggested showing respect for superior officers, but everything I'd learned over the past week made normal military courtesy feel inadequate.
Ma'am, before we begin, I need to know if you're still yourself.
The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Silence stretched between us, filled with implications that made the conference room feel smaller and more dangerous.
Meaning, the general asked quietly.
Meaning the alien intelligence I made contact with claimed it had been working with human government officials for over a year.
Claimed it could influence human consciousness through technological interfaces.
I need to know if the people in this room are thinking with their own minds or following programming they don't remember receiving. One of the civilians, a man with gray hair and expensive suit, leaned forward with the kind of smile that suggested he was used to explaining complex topics to people who lacked appropriate clearance levels.
Staff Sergeant, you've been through an extraordinary experience.
It's natural to feel paranoid, to question the motivations of authority figures.
But you need to understand that.
Shut up, I interrupted. The civilian's smile faltered. The general's expression didn't change, but I saw something in her eyes that looked like approval. The alien intelligence told me it had been in communication with human representatives for 18 months. It described negotiations, agreements, cooperation arrangements.
If that's true, then everyone in this room might be compromised.
If it's not true, then you need to hear what I learned before assuming anything about cooperation or negotiation. The general gestured to an empty chair. Sit down, Staff Sergeant.
Tell us what you learned.
I sat, but kept my hands on the equipment bag that contained the only proof I had of what had happened at FOB Phoenix. The NID device, the quantum communication array, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's hidden recordings, physical evidence of events that might otherwise be dismissed as psychological breakdown.
The quantum communication project wasn't designed for defense, I began.
It was designed to facilitate alien control of human consciousness. The entities we've been in contact with don't view humanity as an equal species to be negotiated with. They view us as resources to be managed. I spent the next hour describing everything I'd experienced, everything I'd learned, everything Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's recordings had revealed. The civilian who'd tried to patronize me took notes with the mechanical precision of someone documenting testimony for future reference. The military officer I didn't recognize listened with the focused attention of someone evaluating tactical information. But it was the general's reaction that concerned me most. She didn't look surprised. Not shocked by revelations of alien contact, not alarmed by descriptions of mind control technology, not horrified by accounts of 37 people being reduced to component elements. She listened with the careful attention of someone receiving information that confirmed suspicions rather than revealed new threats. "The modifications you made to the quantum array," she said when I finished my account. "Do you believe they were successful? They disrupted alien communication temporarily. But the equipment was destroyed in the process. Any long-term defensive capabilities would require implementing Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's theories on a much larger scale. Theories that you transmitted to unknown recipients using emergency communication channels." The way she phrased it, not a question, but a statement that suggested they already knew about my transmission attempts. Which meant either they'd been monitoring my activities in real time, or they'd received my emergency broadcasts and understood their significance. "Yes, ma'am." The civilian with the expensive suit cleared his throat. "Staff Sergeant, the situation you've described presents certain challenges for established policy frameworks. The kind of challenges that require careful consideration and coordination with allied governments." "You mean you want to negotiate with them?" "I mean we want to avoid precipitating a conflict with entities whose capabilities we don't fully understand." I looked around the conference table, studying faces that revealed nothing about the thoughts behind them. Standard bureaucratic expressions, professional courtesy masks, the kind of careful neutrality that characterized high-level meetings where careers could be ended with poorly chosen words. But something was wrong with the whole scenario. Not just the content of the discussion, but the context. The timing, the location, the people involved, all of it felt staged, carefully orchestrated to produce a specific outcome. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Known what?" "How long have you known about alien contact? How long have you been aware that the quantum communication project was designed for mind control rather than defense?" The general exchanged glances with the civilian, the kind of silent communication that happens between people who've worked together long enough to develop shorthand for complex concepts. "Staff Sergeant, certain aspects of this situation have been under investigation for several months. Your mission to FOB Phoenix was designed to gather specific intelligence that would help us evaluate the nature and extent of alien influence on human activities." Understanding hit me like cold water. I wasn't sent to make contact. I was sent to test whether Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's defensive theories were viable. Among other objectives, yes. You knew she was developing countermeasures. You knew what happened to the Phoenix team. You sent me to see if her work could be weaponized. The general's expression softened slightly, showing something that might have been regret. "Staff Sergeant, the situation we're dealing with is more complex than any individual mission can address. The entities you encountered represent a threat that exceeds normal military capabilities. Conventional weapons, traditional defense strategies, even nuclear deterrence, none of it applies to beings that exist partially outside our dimensional framework. So you're surrendering. We're adapting." The word hung in the air like a confession. Not fighting, not resisting, but adapting. Finding ways to accommodate alien objectives while maintaining the illusion of human independence. I stood up, equipment bag in hand. "I need to know, are you making this decision with your own minds, or are you following programming you don't remember receiving?" The question produced another exchange of glances around the table. But, this time, the civilian with the expensive suit answered. "That's precisely what we need to determine. The modifications you made to the quantum array disrupted alien communication, but they also eliminated our ability to verify whether specific individuals have been subject to consciousness manipulation. We need to understand the scope of alien influence before we can develop appropriate response strategies." Which sounded reasonable until you remembered that the people developing response strategies might themselves be compromised. A circular problem that could only be solved by someone immune to alien manipulation, someone whose thoughts remained their own regardless of technological interface attempts.
Someone like me. You want me to serve as verification, I said. Test people for alien influence using modified quantum communication equipment. Among other responsibilities. And, if I find that government officials have been compromised? What happens then?
The general leaned back in her chair, and, for the first time since I'd known her, she looked tired. Not physically exhausted, but worn down by knowledge that was too heavy for one person to carry.
Then, we'll deal with that situation when it arises.
I looked around the conference room one more time, studying faces that might or might not belong to people thinking their own thoughts. The civilian who'd tried to patronize me continued taking notes with mechanical precision. The military officer I didn't recognize maintained the focused attention of someone evaluating tactical information.
Ms. Anderson watched the proceedings with professional detachment that revealed nothing about her loyalties or objectives.
And, the general sat at the head of the table, wearing stars that had sparked this entire sequence of events when I'd grabbed them in a flickering corridor that felt like it belonged to someone else's life.
I need guarantees, I said finally. What kind of guarantees? Access to Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's complete research files. Technical support from people who understand quantum physics better than I do. And authority to implement defensive measures at any installation where I detect alien influence, regardless of the political consequences.
The civilian with the expensive suit started to object, but the general silenced him with a gesture.
Done.
And, one more thing.
Yes? If I determine that you or anyone else in this room has been compromised by alien influence, I want authorization to take whatever action is necessary to prevent further manipulation. Up to and including the use of lethal force.
The silence that followed was profound. Not just quiet, but the kind of absolute stillness that comes when people realize they've reached a decision point that will determine the future of everyone involved. The general considered my request with the careful attention of someone weighing the fate of nations against the necessity of individual survival.
Agreed.
She stood and walked to a wall safe I hadn't noticed before. Military-grade security, the kind designed to protect information that could change the course of wars. She entered a combination, retrieved a folder marked with classification levels I didn't recognize, and handed it to me.
Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's complete research files. Technical specifications, theoretical frameworks, and her recommendations for large-scale implementation of defensive systems.
The folder felt heavy in my hands. Not just the weight of paper, but the accumulated knowledge of someone who'd paid for her insights with her life. Your official assignment is Special Projects Coordinator, reporting directly to me with classification authority that exceeds normal bureaucratic channels.
Your unofficial assignment is to determine who can be trusted to implement defensive measures against an entity that views human consciousness as controllable technology.
She reached into her jacket and pulled out a new set of identification credentials. Not standard military ID, but something that identified me as having authority I'd never possessed before.
Welcome to the war, Staff Sergeant. Try not to let us lose it.
I looked at the credentials, the research folder, the faces around the conference table that might or might not belong to allies in a conflict most people didn't know existed. Outside the conference room windows, Ramstein Air Base continued its operations under stars that no longer seemed distant and cold. Lights moved across runways where aircraft carried personnel and equipment to destinations around the globe.